Well, welcome everyone. Good to be here. Good to spend some time chatting before we get started. I'm sure we'll have a few more people join us. If you would just take a minute and introduce yourself in the chat, who you are and where you are and what your connection to Central is, that would be great. This is, of course, our third Thursday Lunch and Learn, a chance for anyone in the Central community to gather together to learn about scholarship, ministry practice, personal interests of people in our community. It is a lunch and learn, so if it is lunchtime where you are, we invite you to please go ahead and eat your lunch while we engage our learning together. And we're very excited today to have Reverend Dr. Pamela R. Durso, Central's president. Pam has been the president now for 22 months at Central Seminary.
Really?
Prior to that, she served for many years as executive director of, is that right, 22 months?
No, that's not right. I think it's 16 or 17.
16 or 17 months. That makes more sense, actually.
Okay.
Now that I think about that. Yeah.
You just aged me like 5 months.
Pandemic time's weird. So 18 or so months. Prior to that, Pam served as executive director of Baptist Women in Ministry. She's a historian of church history and Baptist history, and we're thrilled to have her here today to share with us some of the preliminary findings from a recent research project that she has been working on about the influence of Baptist women preachers, a topic that has interested her for many years. So will you please join me in welcoming Pam?
Well, thank you, Jessica. I'm so glad to see all of you, and I would say that today the Central community is generously defined because there are a few of my former students here that have joined us, and I'm glad to see your faces and to have all of you join us for this conversation. I hope this will be both informative and hopefully inspiring for each of you as we talk about Baptist women in preaching. I need to start with a little bit of personal context. I grew up the daughter of a Southern Baptist preacher in Texas. Most of my growing up years were in the 1960s and 1970s. I did not see a woman pray or hear a woman pray publicly in worship services as a child or teenager. And I, of course, never saw a woman in the pulpit preach during my growing up years. It wasn't until I got to seminary. I went to Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, and joined University Baptist Church in Fort Worth. And the associate pastor there, Glenda Fontenot, one Sunday stepped into the pulpit to preach. And I was horrified that she would have the audacity to preach from the pulpit. What was she thinking? I was enrolled as a seminary student, had sensed a strong call from God, and yet still believe that women should not be preachers at my young age of 22. I learned quickly from Glenda that women can be called by God to preach, and women preach very well. So seminary taught me many things, but that's one of the great takeaways is learning to embrace the voices of women in the pulpit myself. And I preached my very first sermon in seminary, in a seminary class. It was required of my degree program for us to take two preaching classes, in fact, and I had to preach 2 sermons. So I did that very reluctantly. I had no intention of ever preaching again. I was going to do it for a grade because in seminary, grades were what mattered to me. So I was going to make a good grade no matter what. And so I preached, and that was it. I was done with preaching. And I really was. For about 9 or 10 years, I never preached again. I went on with my life and did other things, worked on my doctoral degree. But in 1987, my father invited me into his pulpit to co-preach a sermon with him. And he did it more for a surprise for my mother than he did it for any spiritual reason. But we co-preached a sermon, and I don't know that my father anticipated what would come out of that, because I've been preaching ever since. I never stopped once I started. And so he set me on the path. My Southern Baptist father set me on the path to preach in ways probably he didn't anticipate. And he's heard me preach numerous times since then, and thinks I'm quite a good preacher, but he might be a little prejudiced as a dad. So I'm proud to be his daughter and to follow in his footsteps as a preacher. So my research is very much weighted by my personal experience. And I just have to be honest about that. I began this research out of my own love for preaching and my own desire to learn more about women who were preaching in our Baptist world. And somewhere around 2005, I began to do some research with my friend Eileen Campbell Reed. That year, we published the first State of Women in Baptist Life report. It was a collection of both stories and data about women who were serving in ministry. And one of our focuses was on women preachers. And so that began really a journey of bringing together my personal experience and my research interest around 2005. So for 16 years, this has been an area that I have spent a good bit of time looking at and thinking about. And I've just dropped all my papers on the floor and I'm going to bend over and pick them up. I'm sure that never happens to you, Ruth, when you're in class. So I have discovered a good bit about women preachers. And one of the things that I discovered is that I had heard so many women preach. Around 2012, 2013, I decided to sit down and make a list of all the women, Baptist women I had heard in the pulpit preaching. And I came up with about 60 or 70 names in 2012. And, it's been almost 10 years since then. So I'm guessing that I have heard nearly 200 women preach in person from the pulpit over the course of the last 20, 25 years. So while that doesn't make me an expert on women's preaching, it certainly does make me an enthusiast. I have sat through many sermons by women, and I've also read many sermons. In my work with Baptist Women in Ministry, we have an annual preaching award, Addie Davis Award for Excellence in Preaching. And so I would be kind of the first reader of all of those sermons that would come in. We would receive 8 to 10 sermons every year. So I read all of those sermons. I also read a good number of sermons as I was collecting women's sermons. I have 2 different collections of sermons that have been published. One is called This Is What a Preacher Looks Like, Sermons by Baptist Women in Ministry. It was published in 2010 by Smith & Hellis Publishers. It has 38 sermons by women across Baptist life. There's a great diversity in their experience and their voice. There's racial diversity, theological diversity, and it's a beautiful collection of sermons that I am still very proud of. But in 2015, I put together another collection, and its title is The World is Waiting for You, celebrating the 50th ordination anniversary of Addie Davis. And for those of you who might not know Addie Davis, she was the first Southern Baptist woman ordained to ministry. Watts Street Baptist Church in Durham, North Carolina ordained her in 1964. And so we celebrate her in Baptist women's history as one of our pioneers. She served as a pastor of a church in Vermont, one in Rhode Island, and then came back to her home state of North Carolina and served as a pastor there for a while. So that's a little bit of my personal background. I am an enthusiast when it comes to Baptist women preaching and feel like if there were a competition for who's heard more or read more sermons by Baptist women, I might be in the running to win that contest. But there are probably no competitions like that I know of. So today what I'd like to do is to share a little bit about the historical context, because Jessica invited a church historian to this lunch and learn, and so I have to tell you a few stories from church history, Baptist history. But then I want to share some of my own assumptions and learning from my experience all these years of listening and reading sermons. And then I want to share some of the data that I have collected. Back in March, I was getting ready to present a paper over the summer about Baptist women preaching. And so I thought I'm going to do a survey, gather some hard data to see if my assumptions and learning are backed up in reality. So I did that in March. And then in August, I finally thought, well, if I'm going to collect information about Baptist women preachers, I need the comparison. So I did a survey with male Baptist preachers so I could look at the places there are differences. So we'll look at some of that data. And then at the end, I'd like for you to share stories of things that you have learned from women preachers in your Baptist circles. or what you have learned as a Baptist woman preacher, or what you have learned being in connection with any women who are preaching, and what that has done and shaped, how it has shaped your experience. So first, the historical context. Baptist women preachers have been and are a conundrum for many Baptists. For 400 years, Baptists have held to congregational autonomy, priesthood of believer, equality when it comes to salvation. And yet they have limited the places and roles of women in their churches. And they have often silenced women's voices, especially in the pulpit. Women have been welcome sometimes to testify publicly of their conversion experience, but have rarely been invited to preach sermons within congregational settings. But even though women in Baptist circles have faced that kind of opposition, sometimes oppression, sometimes limitation, Baptist women have found a way. They have found a way to use their preaching voices, and they have used the gifts God has given them. And so it might surprise you to learn that Baptist women have been preaching as far back as 1630s. So there is a document that was published in 1641 that named off 6 Baptist women preachers who were preaching in the streets and in the areas of England during the 1630s. And the names are there. Anne Hempsel, Susan May, Joanne Bofford, Mary Bilbrough, Elizabeth Bancroft, and Arbella Thomas, preaching throughout England in the 1630s. And these women declared that they had taken up preaching because, and this is a quote, there was a deficiency of good men, wherefore it was but fit that virtuous women should supply their places. So the men were not preaching, so the women stepped in to do this work. Anne Hempsel's preaching astonished her listeners, but perhaps not for the reason you might think. They were not astonished because she preached such great sermons or that she was even preaching as a woman. They were astonished by the length of her sermons. The quote about her sermons in this 1641 document is, "Long did she preach, and longer I dare avouch than some of the audience were willing." So one of our earliest Baptist women preachers was very long-winded in her preaching. Another of the English Baptist women preachers was Mrs. Attaway. She was a lace maker and a member of a General Baptist congregation in London. And in the mid-1640s, Presbyterian minister Thomas Edwards, who was a vehement opponent of Baptists, labeled Mrs. Attaway as the mistress of all she preachers on Coleman Street. And it wasn't a compliment. So we have this Baptist she preacher who in 1645 opened her home up to women to share the gospel with them, to teach them Bible lessons. And pretty soon the men were crowding in with the women, and Mrs. Attaway began to exhort them and to teach them the Bible. While she would not have labeled herself as a preacher by modern day standards, that is what she was doing, using scripture text to give lessons in more of a sermonic setting. So while I would claim her as a preacher, Mrs. Attaway might not be comfortable with that label, but she certainly did exhort, and she used the verse in Hebrews 10, verse 25, about Christians being called to exhort one another. And that was what she saw her role as an exhorter of those in her care. In colonial America, we also see she preachers who arrived here and began really to preach the gospel, and most of them were separate Baptists. Separate Baptists, as you may remember if you took church history classes, were that group that arose during the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s. They tended to be evangelistic in their preaching. They had boisterous worship services. They were very emotional in their conversion experiences, and they welcomed women. There were women serving as deaconesses and eldresses among the separate Baptists. There were women who were preaching and exhorting in separate Baptist worship services. Often these women would begin to preach after the official sermon had been preached, and they would come after that sermon and exhort all of those in the congregation, whether they were Christian or not, to confess their sin, to come to the altar. And so the women would exhort and pray. And probably the best known of these separate Baptist women is Martha Stearns Marshall, whose name might be familiar. Martha stirred up controversy everywhere she went, and her family moved often, so she stirred up controversy across colonial, especially in the South and colonial South. First, her family was in Virginia. They moved to North Carolina, then South Carolina, and then Georgia. And in each of those places, there was a good bit of conflict over Martha's being allowed to publicly speak and her husband allowing her to preach in his churches. So much so that in his congregation in North Carolina, his own ordination was delayed because his congregation could not get other churches and other leaders to come and participate in his ordination because of their suspicion of Martha and her public preaching. And so finally, they found enough to gather a small group, and he was ordained in Abbott's Creek Church there in North Carolina. The Marshalls eventually would move to Georgia. They began holding prayer meetings, Brush Arbor prayer meetings near Savannah, Georgia, and near Keokee Creek. And Martha and Daniel would both lead in those prayer services. And if you know anything about colonial history, Georgia as a colony had an established church. The Church of England was the recognized legal church in this colony. And every other faith tradition was not allowed to lead in worship or hold gatherings. Preachers of other faiths were not allowed to preach publicly. And so when the constable learned that the Marshalls were out preaching near the creek, the constable showed up, Daniel continued to preach, and the constable arrested him. And at that point, Martha stepped in and began to defend her husband and to defend the gospel that he was preaching. And she quoted scripture after scripture, and she exhorted the constable to the point that the constable was converted to the Christian faith by Martha's prayers and preaching that day. And so Martha led the way with this constable so that he would know Christ. So Martha was really the better preacher of the two. Truth be told, the historians recognize her as a fiery, fierce preacher who had a great command of scripture. So Martha Stearns Marshall is one of our Baptist women in ministry heroes that we celebrate every year. When we look at Baptists in that period, white women rarely had opportunity to preach, but Black women, it is hard to even find evidence that they were exhorting or preaching at all. There are very little records, and the records that do exist, I cannot find any evidence that there were women preaching in congregations or even enslaved women preaching on their plantations. It's not until after the Revolutionary War that I could find anything that is published about Black women preaching. And one of those Black women preachers, I would call her a preacher. She might not claim that title, but I would call her a preacher is Maria Stewart. I'm sorry. In 1830, Maria Stewart experienced a spiritual conversion and began to write and speak about the injustices that her race had endured. And in September 1832, Maria stood in the Boston in Franklin Hall and spoke to the New England Anti-Slavery Society. And her address was titled, "Why Sit Ye Here and Die?" While her address is often labeled as a political lecture, it surely has the feel of a modern day sermon. It was filled with scripture references, religious oratory. She challenged and exhorted her listeners. She called them to live the Christian faith and to work toward ending the injustices that were being encountered by people of her race. But the interesting thing to me about Maria and her preaching is she shifted the focus. Most of the women preachers that I've discovered to this point focus on conversion and salvation experience. But Maria called attention to the disparities between race, gender, class, and status. And so Maria Stewart was a social justice preacher in 1832. I think that's significant. And I think there were many more women out there, and I'm hopeful that someday we will begin to discover manuscripts and writings, under the beds and in the attics, that we might have more evidence of the women of color who were preaching much earlier than what we know. But that leads us to now. So almost 200 years later, Baptist women preachers are not nearly so rare. There are lots and lots of volumes of sermon collections of Baptist women and other denominational women's preachers. So we have lots of content. We also have all kinds of digital sermons that we can listen to now. So there is so much more information than there was when I started this work back in the 1980s and 1990s. So what have we learned about women? What have I learned about women preachers? Just a few things I'd like to share with you. First, some of my assumptions. After listening to so many sermons and reading so many sermons, I assumed, based on what I had read, is that Baptist women preached from the New Testament. Every time I would collect sermons, I would have to beg for sermons from the Old Testament. All the sermons I would get initially would be from the New Testament. So my assumption is that women preach primarily from the New Testament, and that women preach primarily Jesus, not Paul. Most of the sermons that I collected and have read tend to be based in the Gospels. Another assumption that I have is that women are narrative preachers. The great majority of Baptist women tend to be storytellers. They tell biblical stories, personal stories, and weave those together in beautiful ways. And that's been one of my assumptions, that Baptist women preachers are storytellers. I also discovered in reading all these stories that Baptist women preach in the first person plural rather than in the second person plural. They include themselves in the sermon. And so you hear a lot of we should or we must, and you hear very little you should or you must in women's sermons. There is that inclusivity of their own voice and their own place in those sermons. I also discovered that Baptist women preachers are vulnerable. They share of their own heartbreak and pain in their sermons. They are not shy about telling of their own personal experiences and seeking to relate to those in their audience by sharing of themselves and their stories, which is really a mark of vulnerability that you see in preaching that I had not experienced throughout my life in listening to majority of my preachers as male preachers. So those are some of my assumptions. As I said, I began to do these surveys so that I could have information based more on assumption and more on data. And so I'd like to share some of that data, and I have a PowerPoint that's got some of the graphics on it. And let's see if I can manage to do this just so I can get my PowerPoint. You have shared your screen with me? So I'm not an expert like many of you are about screen sharing, but here goes. Someone's going to have to tell me if they can see it. And I'm going to have to actually put my glasses on to do this. Okay. So can you see this?
No, not yet.
Not yet. How about now?
No.
Okay. Is there something else I need to do that I'm not doing, Jessica?
You click share screen on the bottom.
I did that part.
And just have your PowerPoint open.
Oh, there it came. Now I see it. Here it is. I thought I did that. And here it comes. There, now you can see it, right?
Now we can see it.
Yay, in the beginning. So this is just a snapshot of what I have discovered from the survey, and I'm still working on it. So it is a work in progress and not ready yet for human consumption as far as public. But I wanted you all to see this. Just a little bit about who responded to these two different surveys. And I placed the response by male preachers there at the top and the women at the bottom. I had a total of 133 men who responded to the survey and 283 women who responded to this survey. I think that tells you something right there. It tells you that what I think it tells you is that women preachers tend to be more well networked. They shared this survey very quickly with all of their preacher sisters. And that happened easily for me. The male preachers, I had to work to get up to 133 and share with lots of different people who could share it beyond. So I think that says something to me about the networking that happens with women in ministry. But it also tells you that I have more women preacher friends than I have male preacher friends. I also have more women of color preacher friends than I do men of color preacher friends. So this tells you a little bit about me, but it also tells you about networking, I think. So if you look by the racial identity, those who participated, with the men, there were 77% of those who participated were white, 8% were Black or African American, 7% Asian, and then 2% Latino. So that lets you know just the men that participated. The women, 64% were white, 33% Black or African American, and 3% Latina. And then by age, if you look at the numbers, 2% of those who participated were in their 20s, 31% of the men who participated were in their 30s, 28 in their 40s, 14 in their 50s, 16 in their 60s, and 9 in their 70s. So there's a pretty good breakdown of age ranges that participated as Baptist male preachers. The women, you see about 6% of those are in their 20s, so a little bit higher number of younger women preachers participated than men. 19% in their 30s, 27% in their 40s, 22% in their 50s, 20% in their 60s, and 5% in their 70s. So there's also kind of an even distribution of age when it came to participants in this survey. With regard to denominational affiliation, I sent this survey out widely, and so it went across denominational lines from CBF, ABC, Alliance. There were Southern Baptists who participated, as well as several of the Black Baptist conventions, NBC USA, NBC of America, and Progressive National Baptists, as well as some who identify as other. And just to break those down by gender, with the men, 62% of those were CBF, 28% ABC, 15% are SBC, 12% are other, and 10% Alliance. And then with the women, there was a little bit more diversity around denominational affiliation, with 53% CBF, 22% ABC, 15% other, 12% Alliance of Baptists, 11% Southern Baptist Convention. I'm sure that would come as a shock to some Southern Baptist leaders that number is so high that they have women preaching. And then NBC USA 9% and NBC of America and Progressive both at about 4%. So there was good variety along the denominational lines. So that gives you a snapshot of who participated. But this next screen will tell you about the ministry positions in which these preachers are now serving. And I think this one is a really telling graphic. For male preachers, 66% of them are senior pastors. 22% are other, meaning they may be serving in nonprofit organizations, or they may be pulpit supply preaching. So there's lots of different possibilities in that other. And then 9% are associate and only 2% are chaplains. So if you add this together, 75% of the men who participated are serving in congregational life, either as senior pastor or associate pastor. But for women, those who responded to this question, 32%, the largest number, are other. They're either serving in nonprofit, theological education, pulpit supply, but the majority of the biggest number in this polling, women are not in congregational life. Only 22% of the women who responded are serving as senior pastors, and 27% are associate pastors. 9% are on church staff, and 10% are chaplains. So there is a lot of difference in these numbers. I think several things this tells us is that women do not yet have wide access to the pulpit as senior pastors. Many of those who end up in the pulpit come from other positions, whether it be church positions or non-congregational positions. So I think this is very telling for me. And I'm wondering, when you look at this chart, if there's anything that you see that I'm not seeing. So feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak up whenever you have a thought to share. Your name might show up in my research if you do that, but I'm just saying, you're very welcome. But for this one, it's very telling to me. Any thoughts? Okay. So 75% of men are in congregational service, and only 58% of the women surveyed are in congregational service. Another area that I think is interesting, I ask about years of experience, preaching experience, and these are very different as well. If you take the number of men who have been preaching for more than 25 years, and if you take all those little pie pieces at the top together, 23% of the men who responded have been preaching for more than 25 years, which means many of the men got a very young start in preaching and been preaching ever since. For women, only 13% of women have been preaching more than 25 years. So women have not had the longevity, don't have the experience, and haven't been welcomed into the pulpit as often as men to have that kind of length of preaching experience. But I think the other thing this tells us with regard to women is that their numbers of years of experience are less. And it's some like Mary Beth, who came to preaching later in life. So the length of years that you've been preaching are shorter because you didn't start out as a 22-year-old preacher. You were 23 or 24. So, but I think this tells us that often that men have access earlier to the pulpit and have been preaching longer than women. That's the way that I read these numbers. Any thoughts about any of this?
Pam, have you correlated the age to the years of experience preaching to see if there's any trend there yet?
I have not done that. That's this is kind of my preliminary look at these numbers. So that is to come, and there are lots of different places I need to look at, slice it and dice it a little bit more.
Because that would be really interesting to me if it shows that there are more younger women preachers.
Yes. Well, and I think that's true. And I'll have to look at age versus years of experience. That's a very good thought. So thank you for that. Any other thoughts about this? Okay, the next question that I had was about frequency of preaching. In a typical year, how often do you preach? And I did ask them to look back pre-pandemic, given that 2020 was such a disruption when it comes to preaching. And so that would hopefully give us a better gauge of what a typical traditional kind of a year would look like. And with the responses from the male preachers, the blue is more than twice a week. So 14% of male preachers preach more than twice a week, and 67% are preaching once a week. So you take those together, you end up with about 76% of men are preaching weekly in their congregations. And that would be reflective of the fact that more men are senior pastors than are women. But you have very low numbers when it comes to infrequent times of preaching, like per year, like 2 to 4 times a year, 5 to 7 times a year. Those are down in the 1 to 2%. Men have more opportunities in the pulpit, according to this data, than do women. And if you look at the numbers for women, they're only about 5% of the women who participated in the survey, only 5% are preaching 2 times a week. And only 19% are preaching twice a week. So you come together about 24% of women who have opportunity for frequent weekly preaching in their congregations, as opposed to 76% of the male preachers. And the numbers, when it gets down to the 5 to 7 times a year, 2 to 4 times a year, those go up. 22% of women preachers say they get to preach 2 to 4 times a year. I think that's astonishing that women have such little access to pulpits, and that this is played out in the data of this survey pretty clearly. I'm curious as to your reflections about that, and for those of you who have been preaching, you've been listening to preachers, does this reflect what is happening in your congregations and in your traditions? Any thoughts?
I have a thought to add. When I left pastoral ministry to come work at Central, the opportunities for pulpit supply in my region are just a lot less for women. And I didn't realize that as much until I was kind of in that position of not serving in the church in a full-time position. So when I answered this question, I would have been one of those. I mean, definitely, I think what I'm trying to say is that for women who aren't serving in congregational settings, the opportunities for pulpit supply are a lot less.
Yeah. And even for women who are serving on a church staff, the opportunities to be in the pulpit more than 2 to 4 times a year are very slim. So I think which tells me that most congregations in our Baptist world are hearing male preachers a greater percentage of the time. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, that's also true though when the senior pastor is a woman, that other staff members still have probably that low, my experience, the very low number of times that they can preach. So it may be mostly a function of position. A lot more men are senior pastors.
It's true. So I need to do some further slicing and dicing. I also think it tells us a lot about kind of the sharing of pulpit that we don't do as well in Baptist life, and maybe that's across religious traditions, not just Baptists. I, for one, like to hear lots of voices in the pulpit, but it depends on which congregation. I was a member of a church in Atlanta that we had lots of different voices on a regular basis in the pulpit, and I loved it, hearing those voices. Any other thoughts?
Pam, I also think it would be interesting to investigate the idea that not all Sundays are created equal. That the prominence of Easter Sunday and the third Sunday in June are are very different as far as what those Sundays mean in the life of the church.
This is true. I
And
had preached one time on Easter. I was an interim pastor at the time, but I had to wait, for 30 years in order to be able to preach on an Easter Sunday. And so we had 3 services that day, and I felt like, okay, I've caught up a little bit by preaching 3 times on Easter. Women associates tend to get to preach the week after Christmas and the week after Easter and July the 4th Sunday. But
Right.
that's a good point, Adam. Thanks for that. Any other thoughts?
The other thing I think of in terms of, well, what you spoke of before about how women preachers are more vulnerable, and so what, overall, what are our churches hearing then? And my tendency is to think that it's just more of an authoritarian kind of thing that says this is what is, as opposed to that kind of vulnerability, and how that plays out, in a multitude of churches.
Yeah, that could be true. There's lots more work I need to do on this, Dan, to investigate some of that.
I would guess that if the senior, I think whoever said that it's a role of position, I think there's a lot to that. I think churches expect their senior pastor to preach more often than anybody else generally. And so there's that expectation that if you're the senior pastor, you're going to be the one preaching. So,
That needs to be taken into account. Well, another thing that I investigated in the survey was preaching text. I really was curious if my assumptions that women preach the New Testament is true or not. And it looks like men actually preach the New Testament even more than women. So the numbers, 86%, 89% of men more frequently preach New Testament than they do Old Testament. And 80% of women more frequently preach New Testament texts rather than Old Testament texts. And then there is the reality that many preachers are lectionary preachers and do some combined texting, text references in their sermons, but I asked for majority and this is what I got. So I would say in our Baptist world, we are New Testament preaching people, it looks like to me. And then when I ask about Gospels versus the epistles, the Gospels for men, 89%, and for women, 75%, which that was rather surprising to me. I thought women would be more frequent gospel preachers than epistle preachers. So I've got to do a lot of slicing and dicing with that around age and some other qualifiers I can put in. But I just thought that was an interesting. I don't know exactly what it means yet, but any thoughts about kind of the texts that are chosen by preachers?
I'm kind of
I
surprised.
wonder. Go ahead.
All right, I'm kind of surprised at that. I thought that at the high number of the gospel text used, and so I wonder, okay, am I just simply surprised and I'd been wrong, or is it because of who decided to answer the survey and who did not?
Yeah. And that could be, this is obviously influenced by those who responded. But I am still surprised that so many men chose gospel over epistle. I thought in my life experience, I've heard a lot of male preachers preach from Paul, more than the gospels even. So this does not match up to my life experience. Any other thoughts? Adam, you were going to say something?
It was similar, just that perhaps we have a self-selection filter here of people, men preachers who respond to Dr. Durso and Dr. Campbell Reed are likely to be more progressive in their preaching.
This is true. This is true. So then the last question that I want to talk about this morning is I only asked the male preachers this question about the impact of having more women in Baptist pulpits and how has that influenced their own preaching. And for 60% of them, they said that having more women present in the pulpit has had an impact on their preaching, whereas 33% said it had not had an impact on their preaching. So I had some follow-up questions about this. And then I kind of took these numbers and looked at them according to age and race. So of those 32% who said no, that women's preaching had no impact, the great majority of those who said no are over the age of 40. So about those who said no, there were about 40 said no. And 32 of these, well, I'm going to get my numbers wrong. But 32% said who said no were over the age of 40, and 13% of those who said no, 13 of the 32% were men of color. So I'm going to break down this some more, just seeing how age and race impacts the impact that women have had on pulpits. So my first reading of this is that men who've gone to seminary in the last 20 years have sat in class with women, have heard women preach in their seminary preaching classes, and have friends around them who are women that they've studied with. And so they have had influence on their preaching in their lives because they've been in class and ministered alongside women. Whereas those over the age of 40, 45, their experience probably was different, with fewer women in seminary with them, fewer women preaching in their seminary classes. And then I think race has an impact on this. Many of the African American men who responded and many of the Asian men who responded said no, that women had not had an impact on their preaching. So I need to tease that out some more. I think it's an interesting response. And I don't know what all it means yet, but it is, I think it has something to tell us about the ways in which seminaries have shifted, and their population, student population being more female, has had influence on male students and their preaching voices. And I wanted to share just a few of the responses. I asked an open-ended question about what effect have women preachers had on your own preaching? And here's some of the answers I got. Women have helped me to listen to the women in the text who are often silenced in our sermons. They have shown me my blind spots in preaching. They have provided me with new sources and resources as I preach, because they're using things that men have not typically used. They have shown me these new sources. Women are more fearless in their proclamation and have made me more fearless in mine. The women preachers I know are creative, cutting edge, and have pushed me in that direction. Women have altered my understanding of the gospel. Women preachers have drawn my awareness to the language that I use in preaching and in reading of scripture. They have made me more narrative in my preaching. They have changed my understanding of authority and power, and they have enhanced my reading of the text and connected the text to my own personal experience and helped me to do that in better ways. So there are a lot of answers that I'm still working through, but it seems to me that men under the age of 40 have embraced women as a resource, and their preaching has been strengthened and enriched because they have listened to women preaching, they have sat by women preachers in class, and they have made sure that they are surrounded by women's voices as they are preaching. They're listening to women either virtually or in conferences. So I'm curious as to, especially those of you who are on this call who are men, have women influenced your preaching? How do you see women changing the ways that you have preached? Adam, you unmuted yourself, so now you have to talk.
Well, at the risk of this becoming a praise fest of Dr. Durso. My seminary experience was greatly shaped by Dr. Durso and the women around her that were preaching, and both as my classmates and the professors at McAfee. Because I came to McAfee with the inkling of egalitarian ministry and left McAfee radically committed to egalitarian ministry. And I think it was because I heard, it's one of the things you already mentioned, I heard all of these readings of scripture that were informed by life experiences that I had never had, that I could sit and say, you know, if I had written a sermon on this passage 100 times, I never would have come up with that. And it made me committed to the idea that we can't hear everything that the Spirit is saying to the church, just hearing it from one gender.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Any other thoughts?
There's some women who have greatly challenged and just had a big impact on what I preach, and changed it actually quite a bit.
And one might be in the Zoom room next to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, and yeah, she's had a big impact as well as her sister and their friends.
Yeah.
They've all had a big impact.
So now that I've outed Dan, he is Jessica's father, Jessica Williams' father, just for those of you who might not know. So, so I'm curious, we've got just about 6 or 7 minutes left. I'd love to hear stories about your experience as a preacher, the ways that women have impacted you, whether you're male or female, just some of your responses to this research I've done. I'd love to hear stories. Mary Beth, you're unmuted. Did you have a story you wanted to tell?
I was trying to think of what, back before I went to seminary, I was on a search committee for our church, and we were seriously talking to a pastoral couple that were both ordained pastors. And, you know, so the question was, well, the church can't really afford a couple. How are we going to just hire him? And I said, wait a minute, it's her voice that I like best. You know, what we've heard is that's what really draws me to this couple. I mean, so I'm just saying it's, you know, that was going through that time as sort of the assumption that the male would be the one paid more attention to. We, you know, we did hire them as a couple. Unfortunately, it was like both at 3/4 time, because we didn't feel we could do full time for both of them. But they did do a fairly balanced, you know, each of them like twice a month, I think. So we did hear both voices, and that was very helpful.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Very clear they would not come as you know, that they were to be considered equally.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anybody else? Thoughts?
I think of my sister, who was, when she was in college, our pastor told her that she should go to seminary so she could get married and because she would make a great pastor's wife. Which at the time I was thinking, well, all right, you know, I didn't know anything different. I was, you know, like 17 or whatever. But she did go to seminary. She became a home missionary in her own right, and is a pastor in her own right. So
yeah.
Well, I just want to share my experience as a woman preacher. I preach almost every Sunday because, you know, we just have few people in the church. And Korean people mostly like they worship almost every day. So we need many preachers. And the thing is that, yeah, it's true that almost all the pastors in Korean community are men. But I feel like in terms of preaching, women are better in the sense, male pastor in Korean community, they are more conservative. And when they preach, it tends to be so long, and the way they speak itself is very conservative. So I feel like women with kids and all those, they tend to empathize with the people who come to worship. And so they make it, short and like, to the point. And they can empathize with the congregation too. And when we talk about New Testament, since we come from the refugee camp, most of the time we preach in Old Testament because it's all about Israelites people, and we identify ourselves more with the Israelites people, like as in the exile and all those. And so we preach more on Old Testament. Yeah, and we preach New Testament too. Yeah.
That would be another fascinating study of looking at context and seeing how that impacts both content of sermons and length of sermons and empathy with those who are in the audience. So I may be emailing you to get some more information. That'd be great. I appreciate that. What about the first time you heard a woman preach? How old were you? Is anybody younger than I was at 22? Do you have a first memorable experience of hearing Mary Beth?
I guess having grown up in the North rather than the South, our churches were much more open. And I don't know whether I was preaching, but certainly when youth were reporting on summer camp or youth mission trips or whatever, we had all voices that were brought to the pulpit to share. So there were a lot of, both girls and boys, young people. And I was reflecting recently that when Pam, I gotta be careful. At Dwight Neuenschwander's memorial service, I was reflecting that he was the first one who invited me to preach. And I know it was when I was early 30s, but it was for a lay Sunday. But we had lay people Sundays when different people were invited to preach, but he invited me at that point. So I look back but I knew other women preachers along the way. Yeah.
I think my experience is certainly shaped by Texas Baptist life in the 1960s and 70s, where women didn't really have a role in congregational life. They were the grand exception rather than the normal experience.
And mine was upstate New York.
So Quinta says that she's Methodist, from the Methodist tradition, and wasn't until 2016 when she entered, and I didn't get the rest of that comment. I have to put my glasses back on. When you realize that women not being accepted as pastors and preachers when you entered seminary. Yeah. So most of your church experience has included women. And I would say, for Methodists, that's pretty common that there are more women. The statistics are out there. There are more women pastors in Methodist churches. Well, I think I have used up beyond my time. I've run over by 1 entire minute now, Jessica. So I want to be mindful of the time. So I'll give this back to you.
I just want to say one thing. I grew up going to Catholic church, and my mom still goes to Catholic church. So I'd like to see the similar change in Catholic church. I've never seen any female priest in Catholic church. So that'll be one thing I would like to see.
That will take some work, Anna. But I know a lot of good sisters in the Catholic tradition who are working on it. So
yeah. So I'm waiting, and I'm sure other people are waiting too.
Waiting and praying.
Thank you so much, Pam. both for your research and presenting that to us today, but mostly for your ongoing commitment and passion for women in ministry. And thank you all for being here today. Great to see faculty, students, staff, and alums gathering together, as well as some guests. So we're glad that you're here. Our Lunch and Learns are always open to anybody. And so we hope that you'll join us again. And in fact, our next Lunch and Learn, the third Thursday of November is November 18th at noon Central Time, features Dr. Ruth Roselle, who's here with us today. And Ruth will be presenting for us on the urgency of the climate crisis and how we can respond as people of faith. And I am just going to get the registration link here in the chat real quick so that you can grab that and go ahead and register right away to join us for that important session. And also just an invitation to join us if you're interested next Thursday at 9:30 a.m. Central Time, when we have one of our Reshaping Church Conversations, and Reverend Susan Sparks, who's pastor at Madison Avenue Baptist Church in New York City. She's a pastor, a former lawyer, and a stand-up comedian. And she'll be leading us in a session called Preaching Punchlines, which is about using humor in our sermons. You can find information about that on Central's website under the events page or under Lifelong Learning page and register there. Or if you hang on just a minute, I'll put that link in the chat too. But before we do that, just want to thank you again for coming. And will you join me in giving a big applause to Pam for her important scholarship and advocacy of women in ministry.
Thank you. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks for coming.